My brothers, my sisters, welcome back to the channel. Today we speak not just of Burkina Faso, but of Africa's awakening. If you believe in freedom, unity, and the power of our people, then make sure you subscribe. Share this story, and let the world hear Africa's voice. Because what you are about to witness is not just history, that is destiny. The world was trembling, though no one dared to admit it. Screens flickered in dark rooms, data streams raced across continents, and in every capital, Washington, Moscow, Beijing, Paris, one name kept appearing in classified briefings: Ibrahim Traoré. No one had expected him to last this long. A young soldier from Burkina Faso, a country the world had dismissed as poor, small, and forgettable, had become the most dangerous voice on earth. Not because of weapons, not because of armies, but because of an idea. He spoke of Africa not as a market, not as a pawn, but as a force. And that terrified everyone who had built their empires upon its silence. In a Pentagon sub-level, screens glowed blue under the trembling hum of servers. His speech reached 12 million devices, whispered an American analyst. Unfiltered, no trace of satellite relay. How is that possible? Asked another. No answer came, just the still image of a man in military green, staring into the lens like he was looking through it, beyond it, into history itself. In Beijing, a minister folded his hands. "This is not about gold or land," he murmured. "It's about awakening." And in Moscow, an old advisor to the Kremlin said quietly, "You cannot contain an idea whose time has come." Still, they would try. Secret councils formed, algorithms rewritten, embargoes drafted, all to silence a voice that refused to bow. But what they didn't know was that Ibrahim Traoré had already seen it coming. He was born in dust and fire, not in palaces, not in power. The Sahel's sun had burned through generations of forgotten faces, where children learned early that survival was not a right, but a negotiation. Burkina Faso, the land of upright people, a name whispered with pride, yet weighed down by decades of betrayal. Once the spirit of Thomas Sankara had set this land ablaze with hope, but the fire had long dimmed, replaced by shadows, contracts, coups, debts, and the invisible chains of foreign lenders. When Traoré rose from the ranks, he didn't promise miracles. He promised honesty, discipline, dignity, and that alone made him a target. His first months in power were quiet. Too quiet. He noticed the patterns before anyone else. Shipments delayed, accounts frozen. Ambassadors suddenly on leave. What followed was subtler. Articles questioning his competence, rumors of hidden militias, whispers that he was too radical to lead. But beneath the headlines and political theater, something larger moved. 3 nations, each with its own empire to protect, began to take interest. In Washington, officials debated him in private. He's building alliances outside the dollar system. He's pushing for an African bank independent of the IMF. If that succeeds, we lose leverage over half the continent. In Beijing, the fear was different. Traoré had turned down a lucrative mining contract, one that would have given China exclusive access to Burkina Faso's lithium reserves for 30 years. "No one says no to us," the minister said coldly. He's setting a precedent, and in Moscow whispers echoed through oil-scented corridors. They had backed him at first, seeing him as an anti-Western ally. But now, even Russia saw danger. He wasn't aligning, he was breaking free. A man who wouldn't belong to any bloc, any master. That made him unpredictable. And unpredictability was the one thing superpowers couldn't control. In Ouagadougou, the days grew tense. Drones traced silent paths above the presidential compound. Messages failed to send. His advisors noticed their phones heating strangely, their cameras flickering to life on their own. Every night, Traoré stood at the balcony, watching the city lights die out one by one in rolling blackouts. He could feel the squeeze, not from armies, but from systems. Electricity shortages, currency manipulation, food imports accidentally delayed, a different kind of warfare. Invisible, but suffocating. He gathered his team, young men and women he trusted more for their honesty than their loyalty. Maps, documents, intercepted messages spread across the table like a storm. Someone whispered, "They're isolating us." He nodded. "Then let them." The snake always tightens its grip before it snaps its own neck. Beyond the palace walls, the people suffered in silence. Markets emptied. Mothers lined for bread. Students walked miles just to find a signal to send messages abroad. They didn't know of sanctions or geopolitics. They only knew that their leader's face was now on every foreign broadcast, labeled the radical. But in the darkness of their homes, many whispered a different word, the one who dares. Weeks passed. A strange calm settled over the capital, the kind that comes before a storm no one wants to name. Foreign envoys arrived under the guise of peace talks, offering incentives that were really threats. The IMF sent representatives with polished smiles and veiled warnings. And then came the ultimatum. "Withdraw your initiatives for African unity," the letter read, "or face comprehensive international isolation." He read it alone in his study. For a long moment, he didn't move. The only sound was the ticking of an old wall clock, Sankara's gift, still working decades after his assassination. Then Traoré folded the letter neatly and placed it under the clock's shadow. He looked up at the mirror across the room. He saw not himself, but the reflection of every African leader who had once believed and paid the price. "Isolation," he whispered. A small smile crossed his face. "They think isolation is a weapon, but it's the beginning of freedom." That night, something shifted. A new directive was issued, but not to the public. Burkina Faso quietly severed several intelligence links, backdoors planted in communication networks decades ago. Within hours, Western analysts panicked. Their feeds went dark. Satellite intercepts yielded static. For the first time, the continent's heart went silent, not from oppression, but from independence. But silence has a cost. Without trade, aid, or approval, the nation braced for hardship. And hardship came swiftly. Fuel shortages, export bans, an information blackout that made the people feel forgotten. But something unexpected happened. Instead of riots came resilience. Communities began bartering again, rediscovering old systems of exchange. Farmers shared seed banks. Women's groups distributed food across villages. They were surviving, not because of the world, but in spite of it. Meanwhile, in distant conference rooms, the world powers grew restless. In Washington, a general slammed his palm on the table. "We've lost total visibility." In Beijing, an analyst frowned. His digital blackout is spreading. 6 neighboring nations have adopted his model. In Moscow, silence. A single candle burned beside an old map of Africa. The advisor leaned forward, tracing the borders softly with his finger. "He's not leading a country," he whispered. "He's leading a contagion." The whispers reached everywhere. Journalists called him the ghost president. Academics called him the new Sankara. And the intelligence world called him the threat. But in the alleys of Ouagadougou, he was just Ibrahim, the soldier who walked alone at dawn, greeting vendors and children before sunrise. His presence both comforting and unsettling. They didn't see power in his uniform. They saw reflection. The embodiment of their own exhaustion turned into defiance. One morning, he stood atop a dusty ridge overlooking the city. The horizon shimmered gold. His aide asked quietly, "Do you think they'll stop?" Traoré didn't answer immediately. He simply watched as a group of children ran barefoot across the field below, their laughter breaking through the silence like light through clouds. Finally, he said, "No, they won't stop, but neither will we." He turned back toward the capital, his capital, not as a ruler, but as a man walking into history's most dangerous storm. And somewhere, deep within the digital corridors of the world's most powerful surveillance agencies, a new file was opened. Its name, Operation Silence. Under primary objective, it read in stark white letters, "Neutralize Ibrahim Traoré before his message becomes uncontrollable." It began quietly, as all great wars do. No marching armies, no tanks rolling over borders. Only whispers, coded, invisible, and deadly. First came the stories. Foreign media outlets, all at once, began reporting strange headlines. Burkina Faso under dictatorship. Human rights violations in the Sahel. New regime threatens stability. They spoke with confidence, citing anonymous sources and leaked documents that no one had ever seen. Inside the presidential office, Ibrahim Traoré watched the broadcasts in silence. He didn't flinch. He simply turned the screen off. Outside, the city was restless. Internet speed slowed to a crawl. Radio stations, once lively with music and laughter, were now filled with static. An invisible hand was choking the information stream, the same hand that had silenced so many before. Yet this time, it met resistance. A network began forming in the shadows. Hackers, journalists, and whistleblowers from across Africa, calling themselves the Continental Signal, united through encrypted channels. Their mission was simple: to keep the truth alive. They bypassed Western networks, transmitting messages through buried satellites and coded sound frequencies on community radios. Whenever one station was shut down, another rose the next day, carrying the same message: they cannot silence all of us. In Washington, a closed-door meeting convened at dawn. Intelligence chiefs reviewed reports filled with anomalies. "Our proxies in West Africa have failed," one analyst muttered. "We've sanctioned everything: food, fuel, currency. But the people aren't turning against him." "Then make them," a senior voice said coldly. "Starve the loyalty out of them." The next week, shipments bound for Burkina Faso vanished mid-sea. Medical supplies, grain imports, fuel convoys, all lost in transit. Hospitals dimmed. Markets emptied. The world watched in silence, pretending not to see the cruelty. But something unexpected happened again. Instead of breaking, the people adapted. They turned their pain into unity. Old community wells reopened. Students built solar batteries from scrap metal. Farmers pooled harvests. And slowly, the impossible began to happen. A nation under siege started to function without the world's permission. The warning came too late. One humid evening, under the flicker of streetlights, an unmarked convoy slipped through the eastern border. It carried 6 men trained by foreign intelligence, armed with untraceable weapons. Their mission was clear: end the experiment. Inside the compound, Traoré was working late, reviewing local reports on irrigation and power grids. At 2:13 a.m., the security system went offline. No alarm, no noise. Only silence, the kind that screams before chaos. Then, gunfire. The guards fell. Windows shattered. Smoke filled the corridors. When they reached his office, the door was open, the chair empty. The attackers swept through the building, room by room, finding only flickering lights and empty halls. Outside, a faint sound echoed through the mist, a generator starting. Then headlights. A single armored vehicle pulling away from the back gate. By the time reinforcements arrived, the convoy was gone. The attackers had vanished, and Ibrahim Traoré, alive, reappeared at dawn, walking through the city streets, surrounded by his soldiers. He said nothing to the press, only this: "If they think darkness will swallow us, they forget. We were born in it." The failed attempt made headlines worldwide. But the truth was buried under layers of fiction. Western media called it an internal power struggle. China called it a domestic incident. Russia called it a misunderstanding. But intelligence networks whispered otherwise. Someone had intervened that night. Surveillance logs showed interference from multiple regions: Africa, Europe, even South America. It was as if the entire network had gone haywire, protecting him with impossible precision. Rumors spread of a hidden group, the Africoms, a decentralized force of scientists, ex-soldiers, and cyber experts who believed Traoré was the last line before total recolonization. No one knew their numbers, their faces, or their base, but one thing was certain. Every time a bullet was fired, a satellite went dark. Weeks later, the world's financial powers delivered their blow. The Global Monetary Alliance, an informal coalition between the US, Russia, and China, issued a coordinated embargo, cutting Burkina Faso off from international trade, currency exchange, and digital banking. No credit, no imports. No recognition. In theory, this was a death sentence for a small, landlocked nation. But once again, theory failed. Traoré ordered the creation of a local digital currency, encrypted and backed by real resources, crops, minerals, and cooperative labor. It wasn't just an economic move. It was a statement. If you control the world through money, he said in a broadcast, then money must no longer control the world. The broadcast went viral, not through global media, but through whispers. Copied, translated and shared across Africa, it spread faster than fire. Young Africans began protesting not against their leaders, but for their right to sovereignty. From Dakar to Kinshasa, from Nairobi to Lagos, the name Traoré became a quiet symbol of rebellion, and for the first time in decades, the world powers saw something they hadn't planned for: unity. But unity had a cost. With every step forward, the pressure intensified. Satellite feeds showed drones circling Ouagadougou. Foreign diplomats fled the city, and in the darkness of an abandoned warehouse, Traoré met with the anonymous architects of the Continental Signal. There were no introductions, no titles, only purpose. On a flickering screen, one of the network's voices spoke. They're preparing a final act. Discredit or destroy. It doesn't matter which comes first. The voice went silent. Then another replaced it, calm but heavy. They're building a narrative. The assassination will come with a story. That you lost control. That you became the very thing you fought. Traoré looked down at the flickering light on the table. A faint blue signal pulsing like a heartbeat. Then we change the story, he said quietly. We tell our own before they write our ending. And so began the Operation Dawn, a plan not to fight, but to reveal. Hidden archives, secret trade deals, unmarked bank accounts, years of suppressed evidence across continents, prepared for release at the right moment. A truth weapon forged not of bullets, but of transparency. But even revolutions are not safe from shadows. Within his own circle, cracks began to show. An advisor, once a friend, had been leaking locations and internal memos to foreign agents. When discovered, he fled, leaving behind only one line in his encrypted messages. You don't understand, Ibrahim. They already know everything. For the first time, Traoré hesitated. The invisible walls around him seemed to close in tighter. Was the enemy outside or inside? He began to sleep less. His voice grew quieter, more reflective. Those closest to him noticed. The man who once spoke like thunder now spoke like the calm before it. Every night he wrote in a black notebook, not speeches or plans, but reflections. Lines that read more like prayers than politics. To lead is to stand on a mountain of mirrors, he wrote. Each one reflecting betrayal, until all that's left is your own shadow staring back. Yet even as he wrestled with doubt, the people refused to surrender. They began painting walls with a single word: rise. When police tried to erase it, children wrote it again. It appeared overnight across cities, bridges, even embassy walls. No one organized it. It simply happened. A movement without a name, without a leader, born from the spirit of a continent that had seen too much silence. And suddenly, the very thing the world powers feared most became unstoppable, an awakening they couldn't assassinate. The tension reached its peak when all three superpowers, the United States, China, and Russia, proposed an emergency summit. The official statement called it a forum for stabilization, but to insiders it was clear they were planning something decisive. Burkina Faso was invited last. The message was simple and chilling: attend or face consequences beyond comprehension. That night, Traoré sat alone overlooking the city skyline. Thunder rolled in the distance, a storm crawling across the horizon. He thought of the generations before him, Sankara, Lumumba, and Nkrumah, all silenced, all buried beneath headlines of stability. He whispered to himself, they tried to silence them. And still here I am, lightning cracked. Rain began to fall, slow, heavy, unrelenting. He turned to his aide. Prepare the delegation, he said. Where to, sir? He looked out the window. Geneva. And so the stage was set. The leader they couldn't buy, bribe, or break was now walking into the lion's den, not with an army, but with a plan that would shake the very order of the world. The world wanted his silence. Instead, it was about to hear his echo. The silence before the storm was deceptive. In the heart of Ouagadougou, beneath the dusty haze that hung low over the capital, the machinery of foreign power began to stir. 3 continents away, Men in tailored suits gathered behind glass walls, staring at satellite maps of Burkina Faso, a small country that had somehow become the axis of their unease. In Washington, analysts marked red circles around newly secured gold fields. In Moscow, intelligence chiefs whispered about Traoré's growing ties to youth movements that threatened their own African footholds. In Beijing, financial advisors warned the party that his nationalization decrees could inspire others to reject Chinese loans and infrastructure contracts. The world was shifting, not through armies or alliances, but through the defiance of one man, and that man was now in danger. Rumors began to swirl across the Sahel. Traoré's convoy was being tracked. His phone lines were compromised. Foreign advisors started vanishing near border towns. Every movement he made was shadowed by something unseen, something coordinated. The people did not know the full truth, but they felt it. They could sense the invisible pressure building against their leader, like a storm crouching at the horizon, gathering lightning. Meanwhile, inside the presidential compound, Traoré spent his nights in a small room lit by one flickering bulb. The air was stale, the maps on his walls marked with pins and strings. He was tracing patterns of aid shipments, rebel movements, energy contracts, and realizing that every path led not to the soil of Africa, but to foreign capitals controlling its veins. To defy them would mean total isolation. To obey them would mean betraying everything he stood for. He made his choice in silence. Then came the sanctions. The world's financial system moved like a blade. Western banks froze transactions linked to Burkina Faso's development funds. Chinese state firms withdrew engineers overnight. Russian contractors quietly dismantled their radar systems and left the desert without explanation. Overnight, the nation went dark. Fuel dried up. Hospitals rationed electricity. Bread lines stretched into the dawn. Mothers held their children beneath empty grain silos, waiting for trucks that would never arrive. And yet, no one blamed him. Not yet. Instead, murals began to appear on the walls of the capital. A man raising his fist, surrounded by chains cracking like lightning. The words scrawled beneath it read, "They fear our freedom." It was no longer about Burkina Faso. It was about all of Africa, but not everyone shared his vision. Inside the army, whispers of discontent began to echo. Officers loyal to foreign intelligence agencies were offered money, visas, and promises of power. Files leaked, reports, false or true, of internal corruption. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew fast. The plot was not a coup. It was a fracture, a deliberate splintering of his support base. Soon, protests erupted in cities. They were not organic, they were orchestrated. Banners printed abroad, slogans circulated by shadow accounts. Fake videos of soldiers defecting, all spreading like wildfire. The message was clear. Traoré is losing control. As chaos rippled through the nation, foreign drones began circling high above the Sahel, cloaked in silence. Communications were intercepted. Spies moved through refugee camps disguised as aid workers. Every step Traoré took, every convoy he sent, was logged and transmitted. But the young leader was no stranger to deception. He understood that the war was not fought with guns anymore. It was fought with narratives, so he crafted his own. He began releasing footage, not propaganda, but truth. Videos of children sleeping beside dried wells, farmers holding empty bowls where rice should have been, miners buried alive under contracts signed in foreign boardrooms. He spoke not in words, but in images, and the world watched. Within weeks, hashtags spread across African social media. Let Burkina breathe. Traoré speaks for us. Africa awakens. Students in Ghana, Mali, and Niger took to the streets holding his portrait. African soldiers began refusing to obey foreign military advisors. A new fire was spreading, uncontrollable, intangible, and terrifying to the powers that once felt untouchable. The CIA called it the Traoré effect. Beijing called it destabilizing African unity. Moscow called it a dangerous precedent. But to the people, it was hope. And then something strange happened. Anonymous files began leaking to international media. Classified documents exposing secret gold agreements between global banks and former African dictators. Emails showing foreign governments had funded stability programs that drained local economies dry. Each leak hit like thunder. Each revelation ignited more outrage. No one knew where the leaks came from. Some said they came from hackers sympathetic to Traoré. Others whispered that insiders within Western agencies had grown disillusioned and decided to expose the truth. The world was spinning, and for the first time, not in their control, but the retaliation was swift. Covert drone strike hit a convoy on the northern border, allegedly targeting militants. The explosion leveled 3 civilian trucks carrying food aid. Dozens died. Traoré's government was blamed instantly. News networks called him reckless, unstable, dangerous. He watched in silence as the narrative turned against him. And that night, standing alone on the roof of the presidential palace, the desert wind howling around him, he looked toward the dark horizon and whispered a vow. Not to surrender, but to end the illusion. He knew they would come for him next. Not with weapons, but with isolation, misinformation, and fear. And so, he prepared for what he called the invisible war. Across the continent, lights flickered as African nations began to experience cyber attacks, trade disruptions, and power cuts. It was the same blueprint used for decades. Punish one, warn all. But something was different this time. For the first time in generations, the continent was watching together. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, from Nairobi to Niamey, ordinary Africans began to see through the fog. And as foreign powers tightened their grip, the people whispered a new saying through the markets and streets. If they fear him this much, he must be telling the truth. By the end of that year, Traoré was no longer seen as merely a president. He had become a symbol, a myth reborn in real time, and myths, once born, cannot be silenced. But myths can be hunted. And as the world's greatest powers quietly agreed on one thing, that Ibrahim Traoré had to be removed, a secret operation was set into motion. It would test not only his courage, but the soul of a continent. The air was unnaturally still that night. Ouagadougou lay beneath a bruised sky, not a sound except for the low hum of generators in the distance. Even the dogs had gone quiet. Something unseen was about to unfold. The countdown to midnight had begun, and far above the clouds, the storm had already gathered, not of thunder, but of men. In 3 command centers across 3 continents, silent orders were being transmitted through encrypted channels. Each message carried one name: Target, Traoré. The mission was cloaked under a different pretext: preventive stabilization. But everyone involved knew what it truly was: a silent erasure. The world's most powerful leaders, rivals in every other matter, had finally agreed on one thing. Ibrahim Traoré had become too dangerous to exist. Operation Seraphim, the code name whispered in secret briefings, was designed to unfold like a shadow, leaving no fingerprints behind. American satellites, Russian contractors, and Chinese cyber units, a triangle of quiet cooperation, bound not by friendship, but by fear. Their objective was not merely to remove him. It was to erase his idea. They had studied his patterns for months, his late-night movements, the routes he used to visit military camps unannounced, the gaps in his convoy schedules. Every heartbeat had been recorded, every decision mapped, and then they found the perfect window, a rural inspection in the northern province, near the gold mines he had nationalized. Minimal security, sparse communication, a place where disappearance would seem plausible. The order was given. The world's invisible hand reached toward the heart of Africa. It began with a whisper of static, communication jammers cutting through the airwaves. Traoré's convoy moved through the desert under moonlight, unaware that satellites were already watching. Drones glided soundlessly above, their cameras pulsing red. And then, a signal. An explosion split the night open. The lead vehicle burst into flames, sand and smoke twisting upward like a serpent. Soldiers scattered for cover, firing blindly into the darkness. The second explosion hit moments later, flipping a truck onto its side. chaos, confusion. Screams swallowed by the wind. But in the midst of it, Ibrahim Traoré survived, bruised, dazed, alive. He crawled from the wreckage, his uniform scorched, his earpiece crackling with static. The sand beneath him shimmered with sparks from burning metal. Around him, silence fell again, the kind that follows devastation. He knew this was no rebel ambush. This was precision. This was foreign. As dawn broke, the desert was littered with blackened steel and the ashes of those who had followed him. His security detail was gone. Communications were dead. The only thing that remained was the horizon, vast, cruel, and endless. And in that moment of absolute isolation, Ibrahim Traoré made a decision that would define him forever. He chose not to hide. He chose to speak. By noon, he had commandeered a small radio transmitter left behind in the wreckage. His voice, weak, cracked, yet unbroken, began to broadcast across local frequencies. No one knew how he found the strength. No one knows the exact words he said, but what the world heard later, replayed across every African screen, was this: "They came for me because I refused to kneel. If I die, know that they fear what Africa might become when it stands unbroken." Those words spread faster than any bullet could. The foreign media immediately launched their counterattack. Headlines screamed, "Burkina Faso leader missing." After armed clash, Western. Anchors speculated about internal mutiny. Russian pundits accused foreign provocateurs, Chinese. Outlets blamed terrorist interference. Every side tried to shape the story, but none could contain the truth, because within hours, satellite images leaked, showing the wreckage, the blast patterns, the unnatural precision of the strike. Anonymous intelligence officers began to whisper what many already suspected. It was not an accident. And for the first time, the illusion shattered. The people no longer saw the great powers as untouchable arbiters of stability. They saw them as predators. Across Africa, something ancient stirred. A unity born not of politics but of shared rage. Protests erupted from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. Flags burned, not of nations but of empires. Students marched with placards bearing a single phrase: "You can kill a man, but not a movement." And as the world watched in disbelief, millions of Africans flooded the streets chanting one name: Traoré. He had vanished into the desert, but his voice had become immortal. Meanwhile, deep within the Sahel, something inexplicable was unfolding. A drone reconnaissance team searching for confirmation of his death spotted something unusual. A cluster of vehicles forming a circle around a clearing. Inside the circle stood Ibrahim Traoré, alive, guarded by a small unit of loyal soldiers who had tracked him through the desert. He was wounded, but standing. Dust covered, yet composed. And as the sun bled across the horizon, he addressed them, not with words of revenge, but with something stranger. Calm determination. He ordered no retaliation. No executions, no counterstrike. Instead, he commanded them to record. He wanted the world to see him, alive, standing against the storm. The footage released days later broke the internet. It showed him, injured, fatigued, yet defiant, declaring that Africa's destiny could not be decided in foreign boardrooms. He stood before the wreckage of his convoy, the wind whipping his tattered flag behind him. The video ended with a single sentence that silenced the world. "If their fear is my crime, then I am guilty of awakening Africa." Panic erupted in diplomatic circles. Leaders called emergency sessions at the UN. Security councils met behind closed doors. But nothing they did could undo the damage, because the strike, their most precise, secretive operation, had achieved the opposite of its goal. Instead of silencing him, they had canonized him. He was no longer just a president. He had become an idea too powerful to erase, an unarmed rebellion that could not be bombed, bribed, or broken. And yet, beneath the triumph, there was tragedy. Many of his closest allies were gone. Towns burned in retaliation. The nation's economy collapsed under renewed sanctions. Hunger gnawed at his people once more. But amidst the despair, something remarkable happened. Ordinary citizens began rebuilding, not waiting for aid, not begging for relief, but organizing on their own. Farmers pooled harvests. Mechanics built wind turbines from scrap. Teachers held open-air schools by candlelight. They called it the Traoré way. He had taught them something deeper than resistance. He had taught them self-reliance. And through that quiet resilience, Burkina Faso began to heal. Foreign powers watched, uncertain, disarmed by a force they couldn't measure or manipulate. Because what Traoré had unleashed wasn't rebellion. It was awakening. He had proven that control was an illusion sustained only by obedience. And now, obedience was collapsing. By the end of that year, Ibrahim Traoré's name had become a whisper across continents. To some, he was a hero. To others, a menace. But to the people of Africa, he was something far greater. The man who survived the unthinkable and reminded them that they were never truly powerless. He had stared into the abyss of global domination, and the abyss had blinked first. But survival was not victory. The world's powers would not rest. And the story of Ibrahim Traoré was far from over. For in the ashes of the desert, a question remained, one that echoed from village to village, from child to elder, from past to future. If one man could shake the world, what could an entire continent do? The desert was quiet again. The smoke had cleared, the satellites had turned away, and for the first time in months, the wind carried no scent of fire. Burkina Faso stood wounded, but not broken. Its soil, once trampled by foreign boots and ambitions, now bore the footprints of its own people rebuilding from the ruins, and somewhere in that silence, beneath the tattered flag still fluttering over Ouagadougou, a new dawn was being born, not of victory, but of awakening. They had tried to erase him. They had tried to drown him beneath sanctions, disinformation, and death. But the world had watched, and in watching, something changed. The illusion cracked. The myth of control, that small nations could be ruled by invisible hands, began to disintegrate in real time. For decades, they had said Africa needed saving. Now, Africa was saving itself. In the months that followed the failed assassination, Ibrahim Traoré vanished from public view. No one knew where he went. Not his ministers, not his generals, not even the intelligence agencies that had once tracked his every step. Rumors filled the vacuum. Some said he had gone underground, living among the farmers and miners whose pain he had once sworn to heal. Others whispered that he had left the country entirely, traveling through the Sahel disguised as a soldier to see the truth of his people without the veil of power. But one thing was certain. His absence did not create silence. It created faith, because his people had learned something profound. They no longer needed to be led by fear. They could be led by example. In small villages, communities began forming councils of their own. No Western advisors, no distant approval. Farmers traded crops between regions. Artisans rebuilt tools from scrap. Young engineers rigged solar panels from broken metal and mirror glass. The movement spread like wildfire. They called it Project Rebirth. And even without his presence, every citizen moved as though he were still among them, whispering, guiding, reminding them that liberation wasn't granted. It was built. Meanwhile, the world's powers stumbled. Their media narratives no longer held weight. Their banks faced quiet resistance. People refusing loans, nations reconsidering their ties, governments rethinking their dependencies. The empire of influence was crumbling, not with war, but with awareness. The very machine that had once dominated Africa now began feeding on itself, unable to comprehend a revolution that didn't use guns, but consciousness. And deep within their confusion, something remarkable occurred, a silence that felt like defeat. Months later, when Traoré reappeared, he was not in a palace, nor surrounded by guards. He was standing on a dusty hill overlooking a river village, the sun setting behind him. His uniform was faded, his eyes were tired, but his voice, when it finally returned to the air, carried the same unyielding conviction that had once shaken the world. He addressed no camera, no crowd, only the river, and perhaps the ghosts of those who had fallen before him. "They thought they could silence one man," he said quietly, "but they awoke 1,000,000,000 souls." That speech, captured by a local filmmaker and uploaded anonymously, spread like wildfire within hours. It wasn't loud or furious. It was calm, humble, almost mournful, and yet, that very calmness struck deeper than any act of defiance. He spoke of rebuilding, not revenge. Of creation, not conquest. Of unity, not utopia. He reminded his people and the world that revolution is not a single moment, but a mirror. And when people finally look into it, they must decide what they truly see: fear or freedom. Across Africa, murals of his image began appearing again, but this time, he was not painted as a warrior. He was painted as a builder, a craftsman holding not a weapon, but a seed. In markets, his name became a symbol of resilience. In classrooms, his speeches became lessons. In parliaments, his ideas became policies. And in the eyes of a generation, one that had grown up under the shadow of global manipulation, he had become more than a leader. He was the reminder that Africa was never meant to crawl. Outside the continent, the reaction was uneasy. Western pundits debated how a minor military ruler could inspire such unity. Chinese advisors warned of uncontrolled sovereignty. Russian strategists called it a philosophical contagion, but none of them could stop it. Because the idea had already crossed borders, oceans, and ideologies. It was no longer about geopolitics. It was about dignity, and dignity, once rediscovered, cannot be colonized again. The IMF quietly revised its policies toward African nations. Foreign investors returned, not with contracts demanding control, but with partnerships built on respect. The United Nations convened emergency sessions to address global equity in development. But behind every reform, every headline, and every speech, there lingered one undeniable truth. It had taken a man they tried to destroy to remind the world that freedom does not ask permission. Years later, when historians would write about him, they would struggle to categorize him. Was he a soldier, a visionary, a rebel, or simply a mirror reflecting the hypocrisy of the modern world? No title would fit, because titles belong to systems, and he had outgrown them all. One final image remains, captured by a drone months after his reappearance. It showed him walking alone along a dirt road at sunset, the orange glow swallowing his silhouette. In the distance, children played beside a half-built wind turbine, their laughter echoing through the golden dust. There were no guards, no symbols of power, just a man, his people, and the horizon. And that image, quiet, unassuming, eternal, became the closing chapter of an era. They tried to silence him. But silence became his loudest weapon. They tried to erase him. But erasure became his immortality. They tried to divide his people, but unity became their rebellion. And in the end, it was not America, Russia, or China that defined him. It was Africa, because Ibrahim Traoré was not the spark that started the fire. He was the wind that reminded the embers they were still alive. As the final dawn rose over the red earth of Burkina Faso, a single question lingered in the air, unspoken, eternal, haunting. Is this the day the world stopped ruling Africa, and Africa began to rule itself?